Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Comments in the media about King Charles's visit to Australia have raised again speculation about the fact that he could have become Governor-General of Australia during the 1980s, but that this was killed off by the Hawke Labor Government. I've no direct knowledge of what happened about the Governor-Generalship, but it did bring to mind a file from the British government that I dug out some years ago about an informal request that was made by the Labor government of Victoria for Prince Charles to become Governor of Victoria in 1985, and the efforts that were made by the palace and the British government to quash it. There are two important pieces of context you need to know to make sense of what occurred. The first was timing. This occurred in November to December 1985, which was just before the Australia Acts 1986 came into effect on the 3rd of March the following year. Under a rather bizarre constitutional anomaly, Australia had a separate crown at the Commonwealth level from about 1930, with the monarch being advised upon the exercise of his or her powers about Commonwealth, and by that I mean federal, matters such as the appointment of the Governor-General of Australia by Commonwealth ministers. However, the Australian states did not fall within that crown. They retained a separate relationship with the monarch, but as colonial dependencies of the British Crown. So the appointment of an Australian state governor was made by the monarch upon the advice of British ministers, not Australian ministers. Now, I know that all sounds rather absurd because the states, of course, were constituent parts of the Commonwealth of Australia, which had its own separate crown. But that was the way it actually was, both in theory and practice. For those of you wanting to know more about the detail of that, I have actually written a book about it, here, The Chameleon Crown, although I'm actually about to update it with a new edition, so wait for that one if you can't find the existing one in a second-hand bookstore. In practice, Australian state premiers would write to the British Foreign Secretary making their own recommendations about state matters, such as the appointment or removal of a state governor, but the power rested with the British government to advise the monarch. Mostly, British ministers did as they were requested by the state, but sometimes they acted differently if it was in their interest to do so. The main purpose of the Australia Acts 1986 was to end that status of the Australian states as colonial dependencies of the British Crown. Section 7 stated that the monarch was to be advised by the state premier rather than British ministers on matters such as the appointment of the state governor. But the Queen, during the negotiation of the Australia Acts, was worried about being caught between conflicting Commonwealth and state advice, particularly when she was visiting Australia. In the 1970s, the Queensland Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, had tried to use the Queen politically by requesting that she extend the term of a governor who had recently made critical comments about the Whitlam government in order to convey the suggestion that she was supporting the governor's view. The British government refused to advise the Queen to do this, as of course the British government retained power over advice to the Queen on state matters. The Queen was therefore very wary about such an issue arising again once the Australia Acts were passed and she no longer had the British government to block any advice that would politicise her role or bring her into conflict with her other governments. She was particularly worried about what she would be advised to do while visiting Australia, such as reading a speech on the opening of a parliament that attacked her other governments in Australia. The draft of Section 7 of the Australia Acts was therefore altered to say that when the monarch was personally in a state, he or she was, quote, not precluded, unquote, from exercising his or her powers and functions with respect to the state. The words not precluded were polite code for a convention allowing the monarch to refuse to act upon advice to do things when in a state if the monarch did not wish to do them. Now, the second piece of context is that the Governor of Victoria, Sir Brian Murray, had recently been engulfed in controversy and forced to resign in October 1985. The Labor Premier, John Cain, was acutely conscious of the fact that his father, also called John Cain, had lost office as Premier after supply was blocked by the Victorian Upper House. And I will do some other videos about that rather fascinating Victorian history on another occasion. In 1985, the younger John Cain was afraid that the Victorian governor was colluding with the opposition leaders in a plan to block supply and then cause his dismissal. While I've not actually been able to dig up any evidence to substantiate that concern, and if anyone does have any, please let me know, it was certainly the case that Cain genuinely was concerned that this was going to happen. We know that because it's set out in two letters that the Governor-General, Sir Ninian Stephen, sent to the Palace in November 1984 and March 1985. The Governor-General told the Palace that Cain believed, quote, the opposition would block supply and the governor would force him to another general election under threat of dismissal, unquote. Sir Ninian added that, knowing the personalities involved, he did not think that the Premier was being unduly alarmist in fearing that the governor might act in this manner if the opposition blocked supply. He suggested that the Palace counsel the governor about the desirability of maintaining good relations with the Premier, while noting that he respected the reluctance of the Palace to, quote, in any way intermeddle with local Australian political affairs, unquote. Cain saw his chance to get rid of the governor after he became aware that the governor had accepted free international airfares and accommodation on an overseas trip in breach of an old regulation. While he pressured Sir Brian Murray to resign, he sent his Deputy Premier to London to persuade the British government to advise the Queen to dismiss Murray. This was at the beginning of October 1985. The British Foreign Secretary requested legal advice about whether he had a discretion in the matter and whether he had to satisfy himself separately as to the facts and the appropriate level of punishment. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth Government threatened to terminate the forthcoming visit of the Prince and Princess of Wales to Victoria unless the matter were resolved. Under very strong pressure, Sir Brian Murray resigned as Governor on the 3rd of October 1985, avoiding his dismissal. The visit of Prince Charles and Princess Diana then went ahead on the 26th of October 1985 with the Lieutenant Governor, the Chief Justice, filling the role of host in the absence of a governor. The tour was very successful. This is the context in which the rather unusual overture was made for Prince Charles to become Governor of Victoria. Here is what the British High Commissioner, Sir John Ley, said in his formal account to Sir Anthony Ackland, the Permanent Under-Secretary of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, on the 6th of November 1985. Quote, I was surprised, to say the least, to be asked by the Secretary of the Premier's Department in Victoria, George Brower, during the course of a tete-a-tete lunch in Melbourne last Monday, whether I thought there was any possibility that the Prince of Wales would be willing to become the next Governor of Victoria in place of the recently resigned Sir Brian Murray. I wondered at first whether he was being serious or at most just musing out loud. But from the way he went on, I have no doubt that his inquiry was, although totally informal and unofficial, not a casual one and must have been discussed with the Premier, John Cain, before he made it. Brower explained that after the recent trauma, they were looking for someone who could be a healer, and having seen how the Prince and Princess had gone down during their visit to Victoria, he had no doubt that he would be just that. Of course, he had no idea whether Prince Charles could manage a 2-year stint of this kind. The fact that he mentioned the timescale indicates in itself that the approach had been thought out. Moreover, he could foresee that there might be some hesitations in the palace lest the prince be embroiled in political arguments and controversy. For example, should the opposition threaten to bring down the government by using their majority in the state senate to block supply? This could, however, be taken care of by a voluntary agreement that during the prince's tenure of office, no such action would be taken by any of the major parties, unquote. Now, just to interpolate here, this explains the mystery of why a Labor government would make such a proposal. It would have given Cain a guarantee of 2 years in which the opposition would not block supply, which he would have seen, no doubt, as a political bonus. Sir John Lay went on in his report to say that he told Brouwer, quote, "I could foresee some real problems. For example, it seemed to me that it would cause some awkwardness for the Governor-General and perhaps create embarrassment for him in his relations with the Queen and indeed the Prince himself. Moreover, as Brouwer would know, care had been taken in the new legislation concerning the severance of residual constitutional links to ensure that the Queen, when physically present in the state, would not automatically be obliged to take over all the functions and responsibilities of the governor. If the Prince of Wales became governor in Victoria, the problem which we had all tried so hard to obviate would be made even worse," unquote. Sir John promised Brouwer that he would raise the matter with the Prince of Wales to get an informal, off-the-record reaction. But he said before he did that, he wanted to be sure that this was not a non-starter with Mr. Cain, because he understood Cain to be a Republican at heart. Brouwer said that while that might be so, Cain was also quite relaxed on the subject, and he asked that Sir John pursue the matter. Sir John concluded his report by noting that while the approach came out of the blue, he was sure it was meant seriously, and that if he was to knock it on the head, the quicker he did so, the better. Internal civil service advice within the Foreign Office was also quite opposed to the idea of Prince Charles becoming the Governor of Victoria. It said this, quote, "There are many arguments against the Prince of Wales becoming the Governor of Victoria, and precious few that I can think of in its favour. It would be invidious in any case for him to become Governor of one Australian state, which would risk offending all the rest. It would also be extremely awkward for him to become Governor of Victoria to replace someone who had resigned under political pressure from the state government and whose resignation had been hastened, with some behind-the-scenes encouragement from the Commonwealth Government in Canberra, in order to remove the possible source of embarrassment before the visit to Victoria of the Prince and Princess of Wales," unquote. On the 22nd of November 1985, Prince Charles's private secretary, Sir John Riddell, described the proposal as a non-starter that was, quote, "bordering on lunacy," unquote. He raised it with Prince Charles, who said that he would discuss it with the Queen, with whom he was having lunch that day. Prince Charles later confirmed that he did not support the proposal for the reasons raised by the High Commissioner. He added that his program and priorities would also not permit him to be away in Australia for 2 years. He advised that action should be taken to, quote, "discourage any formal approach as strongly as possible," unquote. There was also brief discussion of the alternative possibility of Prince Charles becoming Governor-General of Australia. Prince Charles's private secretary noted that this possibility had not been raised with Prince Charles during his recent visit to Australia, despite the opportunity offered by a private conversation with Prime Minister Hawke. Prince Charles therefore did not regard it as a viable proposition. At least as far as the British file goes, that was the end of the matter. Whether history would have turned out differently if the Prince and Princess of Wales had spent 2 years together with Prince William in Melbourne, away from the pressures and the paparazzi of London, who knows? Something for Netflix, perhaps. In the meantime, thank you again for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and I will get back to non-royal offerings next week. Goodbye.